everybody, welcome back to World History class. So we are doing the last two sections of notes today, so your notes are going to be due today at the end of class. So go ahead and get your notes out, let's get started. So the cost of the war. So millions had died and even more were wounded. Throw on top of that the 1918 influenza pandemic, which was the spread of disease across a large area and infected 20 million plus people. There was also a major financial toll. Wars are expensive, and due to a lot of the fighting taking place all across Europe, there was a high cost of reconstruction and paying off said debts. And the Allies blamed the defeated Central Powers for all these costs. So they wanted them to pay reparations, or payments for the war damage. This was essentially where we're like, yeah, we're going to send you the bill for all this damage that you caused. Ooh, one click too many. There was also political turmoil. A lot of the major governments in Europe collapsed. Namely, places like Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. All their governments collapsed. Now, we saw a rise of a lot of radical people, or people who wanted to make extreme changes, and dreamed of a building of new social orders. One of those is the conservatives versus Bolshevism, or aka communism. And a lot of colonies saw that the end of the war as a renewed hope for independence. Unfortunately, that wasn't going to happen for them. Now, at the Paris Peace Conference, the Central Powers and Russia were not invited. You'd think you'd invite the other side to the peace conference afterwards. And with everybody there was a lot of conflicting goals. President Wilson of the United States wanted peace without victory, based on the 14 points. David Lloyd George of Great Britain promised a massive rebuild of Great Britain, which is going to cost a lot of money. And George Clemenceau of France wanted to weaken Germany so France never again felt threatened by Germany. If only he knew what was going to happen in about 2 decades. So, the problems. Italy wanted Austria-Hungarian territory, as they were promised. The self-determination problem made things very difficult, and many ruled by Russia, Austria-Hungary, or the Ottoman Empire demanded their own land. Eventually, Wilson had to compromise and get rid of 13 out of the 14 points. The only one he got to keep was the League of Nations, and along with it an idea of collective security, or a system in which a group of nations acts as one to preserve the peace of all. Now, we have a modern-day version of this, the United Nations, that functions in a very similar manner. So, in June of 1919, Germany was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and assume full blame for causing the war, although I will point out for the record, Germany didn't start the war. Austria-Hungary did. And they had to pay huge reparations, which back then was $33 billion, which today would be equivalent to over $33 trillion today. They had to rebuild what was destroyed and pay pensions for all Allied soldiers that were still alive. This tanked the German economy. So they were also very much weakened by this. Their military size was limited. They had to return the territories of Alsace and Lorraine to France. They lost their territory, at least some of it. They were stripped of all their colonies. And Germans living in these territories were forced to go back to Germany or Austria. And Germany had no choice. And there was a lot of... This resentment would help spark World War II in a couple decades. So the outcomes of the peace settlements. So if you look, this was Europe pre-war. This was a few years after the war ended. We get the establishment of the countries Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Czechoslovakia. Austria and Hungary are broken into 2 separate countries, and Yugoslavia, formerly Serbia. We also have the mandate system coming to power, in which we see the self-determination only applied to Europe through a system of mandates, or territories administered by Western powers. The theory was they'd be held until they were able to stand alone. Great Britain and France took over Germany's African colonies, and Japan and Australia essentially divided the Pacific Islands amongst themselves. Now, the League of Nations offered some hope. 40 nations joined. They did negotiate some disputes, and it was an action versus the aggressors. It was the first step towards international organization for peace. However, the idea was sponsored by Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president. The United States didn't join the League of Nations, which very much weakened the League's power in the eyes of everybody involved. Especially when you realize, hey, the guys that came up with this aren't a part of this. Then what's the point? Okay, so let's jump over to Russia and go back in history a little bit to talk about the Russian Revolution. So, it ended the period of Tsarism. The Tsar is basically the equivalent of a king, and Russia had been ruled by the Romanov family for over 300 years. The peasants were suffering. Russia was slow to industrialize. There was a very small middle class and a very large urban working class. Now, this is the Romanov family at the time of the revolution. You have Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their son Nikolai, the heir, as well as their daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Dun dun dun! Yes, that's right, folks. For those of you that are aware of the story of the missing Princess Anastasia, stay tuned. We shall get to it. So the unrest deepened, and not to say bad things about Tsar Nicholas II, he sucked as a military leader. He was very weak, ineffective, and had no limits. The government of Russia at the time was extremely corrupt, the court system didn't work, and Marxists encouraged revolutions. Again, the rise up of the proletariat, or the growing class of factory and railroad workers, miners, and urban wage earners. Remember, we talked about the ideas of the proletariat last unit when we did the Industrial Revolution. So the impact of World War I itself brought about a lot of pride, but strained resources. Now, Tsar Nicholas went out to the front as general. So, Tsarina Alexandra began to meet with this man here, known as Gregory Rasputin, an illiterate peasant and self-proclaimed holy man, who was said to be able to cure the young Tsar to be Nikolai of his hemophilia, which is a blood condition. Now, this also weakened the confidence in the government, and suffice to say, Rasputin liked to sleep around. And he slept with a lot of people's wives. So he was assassinated to protect the monarchy. So eventually, Nicholas would step down and abdicate due to Russia's suffering. Now, the Duma, or essentially their legislative branch, was elected after the revolution and set up a provisional government. Middle-class liberals were prepared a constitution, a Russian republic. However, revolutionary socialists came in, and we see the rise of the Soviets, or a council of workers and soldiers, also, and a more radical group of them known as the Bolsheviks, or radical socialist group, led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin. So, Lenin and his Bolsheviks, they heavily studied and embraced the ideas of Karl Marx. Remember, we talked about him last unit. And he adapted those Marxist ideas to fit the Russian conditions. And the dictatorship over the proletariat was a small number, and the Bolsheviks had the majority, and only revolution could bring change. Germany actually supported the rise of Lenin to weaken Russia in 1917 with the revolution. So, again, it led them to power. We have people like Leon Trotsky, who wrote things like Peace, Land, and Bread, and the provisional government made a lot of mistakes. Alexander Kerensky wanted to continue the war effort and failed massively at the Kerensky offensive. There was no land reform, and the peasants then seized the land. Now, the Bolshevik takeover overthrew the provisional government without struggle. And in Moscow, the former Tsarist center, it became the Bolshevik capital, where they established their headquarters known as the Kremlin. They built up a proletariat socialist state. No private ownership of land. Land was given to the peasants. Workers had a control of factories and mines, and a new red flag symbolized the union between workers and peasants, and the Bolsheviks were renamed the Communists. So Russia then plunged into a civil war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed between Lenin and Germany, and Russia lost land and population, so it was necessary for a revolution. And we have two opposing forces, the Red Army and the White Army. The Red Army being the Communists, or the Bolsheviks, and the White Army being the non-Communists. The Allies heavily supported the White Army because they favored democracy, and they wanted to see possibly Tsar Nicholas put back on the throne. Now, War under communism. There was a lot of terror tactics, where we have something known as the Sheka, or a secret police force which executed suspects that were against the revolution, and there was forced labor camps. And an idea of war communism began to form, in which banks, mines, factories, and railroads all supported the war for the Red Army against the White Army. Now, the Red Army was led by Trotsky, and we also have the Commissars, or Communist Party officials assigned to the army to essentially preach party principles and ensure loyalty. And in 1921, the communists were victorious. So they began to build their own Soviet Union. New government, same problems. But now Russia is referred to as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, or the Soviet Union. Now, there was technically a constitution, in theory, where we had an elected legislature in Russia and a Supreme Soviet. You could vote if you were 18 and older, and workers and peasants held all political power, resources, and the means of the production. In all reality, the Communist Party had all the power, not the people. So, Lenin's new economic policy, or the NEP, was a compromise with capitalism, small business for profit. The state controlled banks, foreign trade, large industries. Peasants held the land and then sold produce for profit. They ended armed threats, and they did improve the standard of living, surprisingly. Now, eventually, Lenin would die rather suddenly due to liver problems, and his successor would be Joseph Stalin, whose ruthless measures to win dictatorial power would return the Soviet Union to pure communism. We'll talk more about him later when we get to World War II. Okay, so we're done with the slides, but I did mention Anastasia, so I do want to talk about Anastasia for a moment. So, Anastasia and the family, the royal family, were taken to a place in Ekaterinburg, known, now mind you, I'm not going to say the actual Russian, but it translated to the House of Special Purpose. That's a scary name already. Now, they were held there for a while, while they were waiting for the official announcement from Lenin to execute the royal family. Now, eventually that order did come, and they took the royal family, as well as some servants that had remained with them that were loyal to them, to the basement, and killed them. Now, it is said that the daughters, again, the aforementioned Olga, Maria, Anastasia, and Tatiana, were said to be bulletproof. Now, this is due to a theory that Alexandra and the girls had been sewing the royal jewels into their corsets and undergarments due to their time in imprisonment, thinking if they were exiled overseas, they could sell them to make some money. Now, eventually they were all killed and then buried in a mass grave in what is actually called the Pig's Meadow. Eventually their bodies would be discovered, not for about 50 years. Their bodies weren't discovered until the 90s, so actually over 50 years. Now, that being said, we don't have all the bodies. We have found enough to identify as Tsar Nicholas II, his son Nikolai, Tsarina Alexandra, and two of the daughters, for sure. They found another body, which could either be Anastasia or Tatiana. We don't know who it belongs to. Now, the popular conspiracy theory is that Anastasia survived and escaped. You know, there's that whole movie and musical and whatnot. But in all reality, more than likely she did not escape from that. So, sorry for those of you that enjoy the Anastasia mythology, or the story that she did survive. My apologies on that. Now, that is it for notes for this unit. Your assignment is to start working on the review guide. It'll be posted on Google Classroom. I'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.